Hello, everyone, and welcome to our podcast. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Tom Jensen. Tom is the CEO of FREYR, a Norwegian-based company that plans to develop up to 43 gigawatt-hour of battery cell production capacity by 2025 to position the company as one of Europe's largest battery cell suppliers. FREYR will supply safe, high energy density, and cost-competitive clean battery cells to the rapidly growing global markets for electric vehicles, energy storage, and marine applications, based on renewable energy source from hydro and wind in a crisp, clear, and energized environment. Tom is also co-founder and partner at Edge, a global advisory, investment, and project development firm aiming to catalyze responsible solutions in the sustainability space. Previously, he held management positions at SYSTEMIQ, Joule Unlimited, and Agrinos. Before that, he held various management positions in finance, strategy, and business development at Norsk Hydro. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our podcast. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Tom Jensen. He is the CEO of FREYR. Tom, welcome.
Thank you very much, Pinar. Pleasure to be here.
Please tell us more about yourself and how you came to create FREYR for our audience.
So, well, I'm a little bit of a climate nerd, to be honest, even though I am an economist by training, unfortunately. And I say that deliberately because I found myself for the last 12, 13 years working on scaling disruptive technology and disruptive solutions and disruptive business models, generally speaking, in the, let's say, sustainability space, with a reasonably strong emphasis on renewable energy. And being a Norwegian, don't hold it against me, we have a pretty large footprint of renewable energy being produced in Norway, but we're also a large energy producing nation and a large oil and gas producing nation. So we have developed this large sort of, footprint around being clever in terms of how to harness energy and harness natural resources. So me in all of this is, I worked in the energy and energy intensive industry all my life. At some point in my career, sort of struck me that I needed to do something useful because I was really sort of contributing to selling a lot of hydrocarbon-based products into the economy. And I just felt that while that is important from sort of a transportation and making the wheels go around in the modern economy point of view, I really felt that we could do better. And I felt that we could do a lot better. And I started to have children and I started to worry about them. I started to get really preoccupied with, the increased concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. And then I really started to look at, okay, what are scalable solutions that can actually matter in a time frame that matters? And that's kind of what brought me, in the broad scheme of things, to FREYR. Of course, I can tell you a lot about my background from, what I did as, a young student and then to my different sort of career paths. But long and short of it, we are producing gigascale levels, sustainable batteries. We are well on track to do that. And I look forward to explaining to you why I think that's important and why we will succeed in doing so.
Yes, let's please go into that. Why do we need clean battery solutions?
So let's just take a step back, right? So from the outset, if you believe in the Paris Agreement, and if you believe in the need to decarbonize society, which I do, we actually do need to cut CO2 emissions in half globally by 2030 to be on track for what all the government leaders around the world agreed to in the Paris Agreement. Now, going from 40 billion tons of CO2 equivalents from man-made sort of industry into the atmosphere annually to 20 in less than 10 years is impossible without some really massive changes. And one of those few, I would say, catalysts for making that happen are batteries. Because batteries can replace combustion engines in transportation. That's what normally people, think about when they think about batteries. So putting batteries in electric vehicles will, of course, eliminate CO2 emissions from the tailpipe. But then on top of that, of course, these batteries need to be charged, and they need to be charged with electricity. And predominantly, unfortunately, still, the world's electricity systems are, by and large, powered by fossil energy. So we also need to replace a very large portion of energy systems globally with renewable energy. And the problem with that is when you put a lot of new renewable energy into the energy systems, you put a lot of pressure and a lot of strain on existing grid connections, etc. And then batteries can, again, play an equally important role to catalyze more renewable energy penetration in the energy systems around us. So batteries then are a catalyst for not only transportation, but also energy systems, which is, again, the biggest contributor in the near term, in our opinion, to mitigate climate change in line with the Paris Agreement. So that's why batteries are fundamentally important. Final thing I'd like to say on this is, if batteries are that important for decarbonizing transportation and energy systems, the batteries themselves should be decarbonized in their production. And a lot of batteries are today produced in Asia in general and China in particular. And unfortunately, so far, there is a lot of fossil energy going into that production. So we need to actually find locations around the world where batteries are produced with renewable energy. And being, again, Norwegian and having FREYR as a production system established in Norway, the electricity is green. That is a very compelling value proposition for me, and the main reason why I started in FREYR and really have been driving the development since.
Amazing. And it gives such great context into, typically when we address issues, we generally come up with, and history has shown us this, right? Like immediate solutions, or like we want to make it quick solutions because we don't want to overcomplicate things. Oh, like, drive an electric vehicle, and then, okay, use, green energy. So choose your energy provider. And these are just like very prescriptive, but we don't necessarily like tend to drill in of like, okay, so if we're all switching to EVs, what are some other potential consequences that might happen with that? So if we're using more batteries, and if batteries are not produced sustainably, then we're creating a whole host of other problems, right? And I think, we've seen this in many other things, like before social media, we didn't know what the problems could be with social media. And even though it has a lot of virtues, one example being awareness around climate change, like first time ever we had a generation of climate strikers, right? And it was global. And it was not thanks to media, but more so social media. But at the same time, there's a lot of vices with that too, because of that, not thinking in maybe deeper of what could have happened. So I love how FREYR's approach is, looking at all different angles and not just saying like, we need batteries, but, how can batteries be more green too? So I guess like also the overview you're showing me clearly requires a very large scale collaboration, right? Like it's systems within systems that need to adopt certain measures. And I was listening to the Greta Thunberg's interview recently, where she was like sharing her frustration about, corporations are not doing anything. We have a 2030 goal, but a lot of it is talk, and we actually need to act way more quickly in so many more things, including innovations like this. So I guess Norway being a great like case example too, like how can we achieve this, right? What is sort of, I guess, your vision in terms of, well, this is a global issue. It's our planet's issue. How do we sort of attack this globally? And what are, I guess you did mention the systems that are sort of taking in place, but what type of collaboration does that look like for it to happen? And I know it's a very big question. We're not asking you to solve the world's problems, but yeah, what is your point of view?
So I think it's great and great perspectives, PNR, and thank you for that. So I think Well, first of all, being Scandinavian, let's just put it that way. Sustainability and the requirement of being green is increasingly a part of the Scandinavians' DNA. So we sort of live and breathe it, right? And being Norwegian in particular, we actually started adopting electric vehicles in Norway more than 10 years ago. So we have today, every month, 50, 60, 70% of all vehicles sold are fully electric.
Wow.
In December last year, over 90% of all vehicles sold had batteries in them. Our electricity is renewable. And of course, having 10 years of experience in that allows us to, let's say, get some institutionalized knowledge around what does it do to the mentality? What does it do to your way of thinking? What does it do to how you adopt to a new, let's say, structure around you? But sort of back to your question, all of sort of these solutions, I think, are all, well, first of all, they're all technically feasible, right? So there is no technical impediment to doing it. And they're now also economically feasible. So batteries into electric vehicles for most of the models today are economically competitive to the alternative, the combustion engine. And interestingly enough, battery systems coupled with renewable energy, solar, wind, other sort of renewable sources, are also competitive to the fossil alternative, be it coal-fired power plants or gas peaker plants or gas-fired power plants, etc., in increasingly large areas around the world. And that is before governments potentially start to incentivize the acceleration of this by introducing stricter and stricter, let's say, CO2 regulation, etc. But what is really required from sort of a systems thinking's point of view is this. I think we need to think about integrated value chain approaches, right? Because there's a lot of, as you pointed out, there's a lot of energy going into this. There's a lot of raw materials going into this. And of course, at the other end of the spectrum, once you start pushing batteries into a lot of electric vehicles and pushing them into containers around the world with solar panels, etc., what do you do at the end of life of the batteries? The good news is that you can recycle everything. So all of the input factors going into production can be recycled back. And typically in the battery industry, you have batteries going into, let's say, electric vehicles. And then when they reach a certain efficiency boundary, then they're not suitable for electric vehicles anymore, but you can put them into a container and they're quite suitable to balance out solar energy, right? So, and they store solar energy when the sun is shining, and then you can use that energy when it's nighttime, kind of thing, or when the wind isn't blowing, and so on. But then at the end of life, when the batteries really are able to store any energy, a lot of the materials in that battery can be repurposed and used again, and again, and over and over and over again. So I think in the industry, we're thinking about I don't know, very high fractions of the original raw material going into a battery can be used and reused over and over again. And we're coming to these, I think the battery industry is a perfect example of a closed loop system. But so I think the onus is on the battery industry to actually create these integrated value chain approaches where the entire value chain from the outset is sustainable, it is socially just, it has governance and transparency mechanisms around them that allow us to be a corporate citizen that people can trust. Because again, back to your social media question, and of course, Greta Thunberg and others who are sort of saying, guys, what are you doing to this place? Show us that you are serious. And show us that you're serious does not mean just talk, talk, talk. It means transparency in sourcing of raw materials. How are they raw materials produced? Is that done in a socially acceptable manner? And how do you treat waste in your production system? How do you treat waste that results from, your production process, etc.? And all of this is totally feasible, economically so. And that is important, right? Because if we want to live in a world where this transition actually happens, it also needs to make economic sense. And we are of the opinion that we can actually integrate and implement these value chains because the value of doing that is so great for society, and then that trickles down to the investors and the shareholders and the technology companies and the different sort of stakeholders in this value chain, including the stakeholders and the employees and everyone. And I think the value to be created from this is so great, and the opportunity to really do that at speed and the requirement for us to do that at speed is kind of a unique setting.
Yeah.
So we have a real opportunity to showcase to the world that we can do this. And I mean, we have the Corona situation behind, or well, we're in the middle of it, hopefully
Yeah.
behind us. But this has shown, right, that, while there's probably a lot to be said and critiqued around, the handling of this situation, I think by and large, governments around the world have collectively responded to this challenge.
Yeah.
Which, was unprecedented and so on and so forth. And we have gotten a broad variety of vaccines up and running in record-breaking time. And now we're sort of reaching 20, 30, 40% global vaccination rates, et cetera, in a time frame that was impossible to conceive 3 years ago. So when anyone is telling me that it's very difficult to foresee a let's say, dramatic reduction in CO2 emissions from an intense electrification over the next 9 years, I tell them, go look somewhere else. Of course it's possible. It's only a matter of mentality. Technology is there, economics are there, people are there, we can do it. It's just a matter of sort of getting our act together and start doing. And that's what FREYR is about. We want to do it, and we want to do it now, and we want to do it from, a favorite vantage point, which we believe Norway and the Nordic region is.
Yeah, I think your point of view is very interesting because, it's almost like somebody can study medicine, right? And so you have like knowledge going into the field, and then you practice for many, many years. And then you have these like learned experiences that everything you're talking about, like setting up the value chain, figuring out the economics, like this comes with really the practice of it, right? And then, there's a reason why people like trust surgeons, maybe if they're like more experienced versus like they're like younger surgeons. And I think you're in that stage where, like, I mean, you studied it, you innovated around it, but as a country too, you're practicing way more than many other countries, that you're also seeing what else is needed. And you're also kind of looking at it in a much more systems view, like, only pushing this is not working, you need to figure out the supply of that, or like, how can we make this circular? So like all these like bird's eye view, I think comes with like an experience of as a country and as a business, and your like past experiences as well sort of brings that point of view. I think, United States is so far behind on like everything you're saying, right? You're talking about like, 80% of cars having batteries. I mean, this is the land of cars, and so many areas of it still doesn't have any like even public transportation systems. So we have a lot to learn on, which comes with a lot of obviously education. For in the end, I'm thinking the end user, right? Because if there's demand from customer and clientele, and your background is in economics, so we can definitely talk more about this too. It's so, it's even if you make $1 less on something as a company, if you see that this is the demand from your clientele, there's no way you can not supply it. Like, you're going to have to supply it. And I think a lot of the issue, or like what we're seeing in, in built environment or energy systems or transportation systems, these are complex systems that use very high level language. And it's very hard for people to sort of like understand what's going on. Even climate change itself it's a big thing, right? Like, what is climate change? But like having accessible information around it, and with tips like on day-to-day, what can you do about this, is so important. And the more this demand, the education can come from the end user, the economics will have to work, right? Because there will be no demand for any of the companies at that stage. And you can't, if you put out a very low quality food at a restaurant, like nobody's going to consume it because they're directly interacting with it and they see, this is not good for me. but it's so hard to see that even in the homes we live in, right? Like, how was this built? What is the embodied carbon? Was it ethically built? Like, all these questions around it, we have no idea. And like, this is like one of the main reasons why we're doing this podcast, even because we're a very research driven studio. And we were kind of like, well, it doesn't make sense if we don't talk about it with the general public, because people need to hear about our research too, because in the end, any problem in the world, the solution really lies with the awareness of the end user. So in terms of that, I think what you were saying, when you bring it to a battery context, and your battery needs to be clean, first of all, I think that's a very clear definition. It's like so much more like you can focus on and educate yourself on that, rather than like climate change, which has multi-layers. And in that sense, that is such a great starting point for so many people to be able to ask, even, what am I using? What goes into my thing? Oh, I'm using a battery. Where's this battery come from? Is this battery clean? Like, these are such more actionable things on a day-to-day, which is why I love how like FREYR's model could actually also, as you said, be a catalyst for such change too. Two like follow-up questions to that, I guess. And obviously you talked about the value chain and the circularity, which also, I guess, in the end makes a lot of sense in terms of the economics of everything. But what is your perspective in terms of like, what does economics mean in a way in an era where we need to, I guess, also think about not only like share value in terms of monetary value, but in terms of, I guess, ethical value or environmental value, as we build a more and more educated customer base. And it's coming, like, as we said, like, we had a first generation of climate strikers. This is not, a far-fetched idea. It's already there. It's Gen Z and onwards, they're going to call out all brands that are not environmentally sustainable. Like, this is already there. So what does economics mean in that new world of how we should be looking at what does corporate profit mean? And like, going to that, how does FREYR sort of, I guess, source to the entire world? Like, clearly we need you, right? So like, how does that expansion happen? I guess you can talk about both like the economic side, but also, I guess, your vision in terms of like growing.
Okay, well, so I think in terms of economics, of course, you need to have, people talk about triple bottom line, right? And they talk about, you have to be green, but you also have to have green numbers, right? So there are all of these sort of slogans and ways in which to think about it. I think the reality is, if you really want something to scale and scale fast, you need to have a profitable proposition. And you need to have a profitable proposition without subsidies. If you can't sort of develop a profitable proposition without subsidies, it cannot scale, right? Because unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on where you sit, capitalism is what sort of drives, investment towards what really ultimately needs to happen, and for the world to build terawatt-hour scale of battery supply annually. And Tesla is arguing 20 terawatt-hours in annual supply, which is 2,000, 4,000 times more than what is produced today. For that to happen, a lot of capital needs to be deployed against this agenda. And for that capital to be deployed against this agenda, it needs to have a promise of profitability. Yeah. But that's what I was trying to say earlier. That is possible because it's already so now that technology and supply chains and the conversion of the raw material into the finished product can now be done profitably against the alternative. And the alternative is combustion engines or fossil fuel generation. And now another aspect to this, which is kind of intertemporal, if I can use a fancy word, is how can we accelerate it, right? And that's also an economic question, but it's more a government question. How can governments accelerate the transition? And by putting a price on carbon, or put it differently, price the externality of CO2 emissions appropriately, that will accelerate the transition. Now, it doesn't need to be there for profitable investments to be channeled to battery value chain, but it will surely speed it up. I mean, that's just a given. And yeah, so that's kind of on the economic side of things. So I believe in triple bottom line. I believe transparency is key. I believe our customers will not buy batteries from us unless we can document how it's produced, where we sourced our raw materials, that we have an ethical footprint. I mean, all of these things are now coming together in more and more jurisdictions around the world, and there will be penalties to be paid if you don't adhere to, standards. So we will adhere to standards. Now, when it comes to your second question, just remind me again of that, right? Because I get
global expansion. Sorry, I tend to respond to everything you're saying.
So I think again, back to my starting point. So I've been working on how do you scale disruptive technology on the one hand, and how do you scale disruptive solutions on the other, right? And I think you need to think holistically of the entire value chain. How can you put together different stakeholders along a complicated value chain, right? And into batteries, you have 15, 20 different inputs or raw material inputs, many of which have various degrees of processing and complicated sort of, processing before it actually ends up in a battery factory. And then that battery cell that we produce, that ends up in a module, and that module ends up in a pack. And then you add a battery management system on top of that, and then you throw, artificial intelligence and machine learning, et cetera, on top of that, and then you sell it to the customer. And then the customer uses it, and then he has to have a recycling solution and so on. So my point is, this is a long, complicated value chain. But how to scale it, and then for FREYR, how to grow, is to show not only to your customer, but also to the entire value chain and to the investors and the governments that, listen, we can replicate this. We can modularly do this over and over and over again in more and more and more jurisdictions, so that we actually can contribute to the transition that we're talking about. And then it becomes this self-fulfilling, engine that sort of just replicates and replicates and replicates. And in that, the final thing I'd like to say is a core tenet for us in terms of us scaling is that our partners and our competitors are successful. Because it's an industry that needs to form and grow and exponentially, widen its horizon. And back to your point about North America, I actually do think that North America is picking up pace very, very fast in this. Especially after, the Biden administration's sort of ambitions in this space. And I am aware, of course, of the political nuances around that ambition. But I do see now that, again, with an economic proposition and with the increased penetration of renewable energy and with, the inevitable transition to better economic solutions, not least, but also, as you pointed out, you don't go into a restaurant and buy food that you don't like, right? And you don't buy food that tastes blah. But you want to have a Tesla. You want to have a Ferrari with batteries, right? You want to have these kinds of really cool models. And now 500 new electric vehicle models are being implemented into the planet in a very short time frame. All of them have really cool gadgets, integrated touchscreen solutions, self or driverless solutions, blah, 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 all linked up to the social media thing, right? So I think this is a total economic transformation, and electrification is at the heart of it. But if we don't do what Greta Thunberg is urging us to do, act responsibly and do it now. then, you know, it doesn't matter. But we are doing that. We can do that. And you know, this is what we're playing into. But again, fundamentally, it needs to be economic. The investors that have invested in FREYR would not have invested in FREYR just because we want to do good, right? They invest in us because we do good also financially, right?
Yeah.
And I think value chain approach and, you know, sustainable solutions, they go hand in hand in this context, and then it's financially viable.
Yeah, I mean, that was so clear. And I think what you're saying in terms of two things you said that sort of goes hand in hand, the public-private partnership, right? Like we see that most of the successful projects in history also comes from that, like government incentives put in the right direction results in good things. If, you know, something is totally government like promoted, generally it doesn't work. Or if it's fully private, sometimes it has its own issues, and generally that goes into a lot of like interest and profitability only. So that like government backing, especially in like scale and supporting that and allowing policies to work for that, right? Like we often talk about like innovations or like rethinking cities and innovations around the urban space. And then when you look at zoning regulations or sort of, I guess, policies that is in place by the city or the state in the United States, especially, the zoning doesn't allow, right? Like all of the things that you see that are needed for the city, we see that the legal system lags. And this is typically the case, though. That's why the public-private partnership is so important, because private innovation in the private space also pushes policy, right? You want a Tesla. I think the biggest win is that when you're not only a need and not only a want. If you're a want, then it comes off as it's like luxury, right? Like, oh, you want that, but you don't have to have it. And when you're only a need, sometimes it's not really, I mean, yeah, we need to do it, but it doesn't urge people because the desirability is not there. But when it's a combination and a want and a need, then that will definitely expedite things, as you were saying. So that's like super interesting. I think in terms of the economic like model and how the system is kind of like changing too, it comes with also openness. Like when you're at just, okay, we need to solve this by 2030, when that's the attitude, you already are accepting that it's going to come with a lot of innovation, prototyping, potentially failures along the way, but keep trying at it, right? And I think what we've seen that is problematic in like very old industries, especially like you see in the tech space, prototyping is seen and failure during prototyping is seen normal. That's part of R&D, and you're always like in innovation mindset. But when you look at built environment or, you know, transportation systems, like things take off they're way more slowly. There's a saying actually, like we use in the architecture space, if the car industry was like the real estate industry, we would still be riding horse carriages, which is very true. I mean, when we look at our built environment. And I think sort of understanding that prototyping can happen at large scale and we need to try and not just deem this didn't work or this was too expensive to do. I mean, if you're trying for the first time, of course it could be expensive. That doesn't mean it's going to be expensive when you scale, right? And I think this has happened already in, especially in the US, there's a lot of conversation about urban farming for like dense environments. And there's a lot of, you know, bad PR around, oh, like that building failed. It was too economically, like it wasn't economically feasible, or it didn't work, but you know, does that mean it's not going to work? I think that sort of mindset around innovation has to sort of blend into other industries. And what you're saying is that that shift is also a little bit happening. Like we are more understanding of like, when we're focused on the goal, we're more understanding of the process. I guess one more question I have is, you talked about clients, like if the industry is successful, then it's better for us because that means that helps with scale. And if you prove to a client that it works, it also drives expansion. And when talking about economics, we're looking at, we need investors, we need clients, obviously, but there are also areas in the world which are already at a lot of disadvantage. And so like electricity was a huge help for those like in Africa, or when we look at some areas in the Middle East, obviously electricity matters a lot. Like you have a hospital because of it and all that. But how do you get clean resources to those demographics that are clearly not prioritized by many other governments? And when policy gets in the mix of global interests, it's already a problem. But what do you think, I guess, could be a way of sort of like, we clearly need solutions like FREYR. How does this expand to the areas that also have economic issues? And their participation is crucial, actually, for reaching the goals that we have. What are your thoughts on that?
So I think, of course, it's a fundamentally very important topic. So let me try to sort of, so first of all, there is also an economic angle to this, right? How, in a way, and I mean, what I mean by saying that is, with the technical solutions that you can implement today, with low-cost solar generation as one example, coupled with sustainable and low-cost battery solutions, you can implement off-grid sort of power generation in areas that don't have a grid, right? Which typically you find in a number of these disadvantaged, locations. And here you actually then have an economic proposition which makes sense in its own right. And you can implement that at a much lower cost than what large grid infrastructure investments would require if you were to take, let's say, conventional power generation in a poor country and get it to those disadvantaged locations. Instead, you can take a very sort of scaled down, modularized version of, 2 containers of solar panels and 2 containers of batteries, and boom, all of a sudden, you have electricity generation for a location that, we're thinking about getting it 10 years from now. You can get that in 2 months, right? It's possible today, economically. And then, of course, somebody needs to finance that. But I mean, today also, with the way in which the democratization of the world is kind of happening, and the democratization of, as you pointed out, social media, and how people are investing against the do-good agenda and so on. And of course, governments, needing to step up to the plate. But ultimately, I think at the heart of this is that the cost of delivering, these basic, for us, basic commodities almost to areas that, don't think about this as possible, that is now actually happening because of technological progress. And batteries, sort of combination with energy generation, can deliver all on that.
That's amazing. And I love that you gave like a very crisp example of how can you do it today. And I think it's just like, it goes back to what we've been saying from the beginning in terms of, it's not that it's not possible. Excuses, you can create a million excuses for not to do something, but like we need to focus on the solution. And most of the issues we have today in the world actually do have something to address it. We just need to allocate our time and resources into the right place. Well, Tom, you're a wealth of knowledge. I could ask you like a million questions and get your opinion on many more things, but I do want to like slowly start wrapping up. So I want to ask you, clearly, I mean, the space in like innovating is not easy. And when it comes with a lot of educating the industry and the mass public, really, it's a hard task. So I would love to ask what your advice would be for anyone who wants to make progress and push boundaries in this field or in others.
So I think I think the most important thing, at least from my vantage point and sort of speaking from my own experience, is you have to ask yourself, is your glass half full or is your glass half empty, right? So in my opinion, the pessimists have never changed the world, right? That does not mean that we don't need realism in what we're doing, but I do think that you need to ask yourself, what is it I have to believe for this to become true? And then ask yourself, is that those things that I have to believe, is it possible to envisage that it can happen? And if the answer to that is yes, then you can sort of work within that framework with a very positive mindset and a half full glass kind of attitude. If you have sort of a mindset of this is not possible or it's impossible, then I think it's going to be very hard. But then I'd like to leave people with maybe a coy kind of way of looking at it. The word impossible, if you put a little dot between the I and the M, it becomes I'm possible. So that's what I think is the core, thing that people should, think about. Why can things be possible as opposed to being impossible? And then, of course, you have to follow your heart. You have to follow what you really like. You have to be passionate about what you do. But, if I just lift myself out of whether it's physics or chemistry or economics or law or any given degree, it really boils down to that. Is it possible? And what can I do to make it possible?
I love that so much. And I think you're the embodiment example of, showing, you can still talk about economics all day, but you can still focus on the solution, right? Because it's not that you lack realism at all. Like you actually help bring that in order to figure out the entire system because you're focused on the end goal and not starting out with the glass half empty. So thank you so much for that, Tom. This was such a treat. I think what else can we share alongside that is happening with FREYR so that people continue to follow or look forward to?
No, I think from our side, we just encourage and challenge everyone to challenge us, right? Please, ask us questions, push us to become better. Join us, right? We love to sort of employ people from all over the world. We do believe 100% in diversity on all aspects, right? And when I say diversity, I don't mean gender or race or religion necessarily. I mean age, mindset, mentality, cultural sort of diversity. There's all sorts of things that go into sort of a meta diversity perspective. But I would sort of say to all of your listeners, we challenge all of you to challenge us to get better, because only by doing that we can make the impossible possible.
Amazing. I think after we launch this episode, you're going to get a lot of job applications. That might happen. Well, thank you, Tom. We'll certainly, keep you posted on when this is airing and when we're announcing it. But this was so amazing. I do want to be mindful of everyone's time, so I'm going to cut it here. But thank you so much for agreeing to do this. This was so insightful.
Thank you, Pinar, and thank you to everyone who made this a reality. I know that there are tons of people working behind the scenes here, so thank you to everyone. Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
And that is this week's episode of What's Wrong with the Podcast. To make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcasting platform. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Links can be found in the episode description, and you can also find them on our website, podcast.whatswrongwith.xyz. If you found value in the show, we would appreciate if you could rate us and leave a review, or you can simply tell your friends about us. For more details on our guests, follow us on Instagram and Twitter. Don't forget to join us next week. Thank you for listening.